The air in Caen was thick with the scent of smoke and sorrow that autumn day in 1087. A fire had just ravaged parts of the city, its embers still smoldering in the distance, casting a grim pall over the gathering crowd. They stood in the shadow of the great stone church of St. Etienne, their faces a mix of obligation and unease, drawn together not by love but by duty. The occasion was a funeral, one meant to honor a king whose name echoed across the seas and battlefields of Europe. William the Conqueror, the man who had bent England to his will and reshaped the destiny of nations. But this was no ordinary farewell. The whispers had already begun to spread, murmurs of a macabre twist to this solemn rite. They said the king's body had swollen, that it refused to fit into its stone tomb, that something unspeakable was about to unfold, and as the mourners shifted uneasily, none could have predicted the grotesque spectacle that would soon sear itself into history. A moment so shocking, it would outlive the man himself. Let's step back, though, to understand how we arrived here, to this church in Normandy, where a king's corpse would become the stuff of nightmares. William's story begins not in glory but in illegitimacy, a child born to a tanner's daughter, and a duke in the rugged lands of Normandy around 1028. They called him the bastard in his youth, a title spat with contempt by those who saw his birth as a stain. His mother, Herleva, was no noblewoman, and his father, Duke Robert, never married her. Yet fate has a way of turning slurs into crowns. When Robert died on pilgrimage, leaving no legitimate heir, 8-year-old William was thrust into the treacherous world of Norman politics. Imagine it, a boy, barely old enough to wield a sword, suddenly Duke of a land teeming with ambitious lords and restless peasants, all eyeing his throne with hunger. Normandy in the 11th century was no gentle place. It was a crucible of violence, where loyalty was as fleeting as a winter's thaw. William's early years were a gauntlet of betrayal and bloodshed. His guardians were murdered one by one, some poisoned, others stabbed in the dark. Rebellions flared like wildfires, and young William learned quickly that power was not given, it was taken. By his teens, he was leading armies, crushing uprisings with a ruthlessness that belied his age. He ordered the hands and feet of rebels lopped off, their bodies displayed as warnings. This was not cruelty for its own sake, or, so he might have argued, it was survival. In a world where weakness invited death, William forged himself into something unyielding, a man who would not bend, not even to his own kin. By the time he was in his 20s, William had secured Normandy, but his ambitions stretched far beyond its borders. Across the English Channel, a throne beckoned. King Edward of England, childless and aging, had reportedly promised William the crown, or, so the Norman chroniclers claimed. But promises in the 11th century were as fragile as parchment in a storm. When Edward died in 1066, the English nobles crowned Harold Godwinson instead, a man with no blood claim but a warrior's reputation. William's response was not negotiation but invasion. He gathered an army, built a fleet, and sailed for England, driven by a conviction that the throne was his by right and by a hunger for glory that burned brighter than any moral scruple. The Battle of Hastings that October was a brutal affair, a clash of steel and will that left thousands dead in the mud of Sussex. Harold fell, an arrow through his eye, and William's forces carved their way to victory. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned king in Westminster Abbey, but even that moment of triumph was tainted by chaos. When the crowd shouted their acclaim, William's nervous guards mistook it for rebellion and set fire to nearby buildings, sending the coronation into disarray. It was an omen, perhaps, of the reign to come. A reign defined not by unity but by conquest, not by peace but by fire. William's rule over England was as unyielding as his grip on Normandy. He crushed rebellions with a ferocity that left entire regions desolate. The Harrying of the North, a campaign in 1069, stands as one of the darkest chapters of his legacy. When northern lords rose against him, William unleashed a scorched earth policy that turned Yorkshire into a wasteland. Villages burned, crops were torched, livestock slaughtered. Those who survived starvation resorted to eating dogs, cats, even human flesh. Chroniclers wrote of tens of thousands dead, their bodies left to rot under open skies. William, it's said, later confessed remorse for these acts, but remorse does not rebuild lives. His wealth grew, his castles rose, and his power solidified, but at a cost that stained the land red. Yet power, for all its might, cannot conquer the frailties of the flesh. William's appetites were as vast as his ambitions. He indulged in the finest foods, roasted meats, rich wines, delicacies that filled the tables of his courts in Rouen and London. His girth expanded with his wealth, his once lean frame bloating until he was a mountain of a man, his belly protruding like a taunt to his enemies. In 1087, while campaigning against his own son Robert in France, disaster struck. The accounts vary. Some say his horse reared, driving the saddle's pommel into his abdomen. Others claim he collapsed from heat and exertion. Whatever the cause, the injury was catastrophic. His intestines, perhaps ruptured, began a slow, agonizing betrayal of his body. For 6 weeks, he lingered in Rouen, racked with pain, surrounded by attendants who could do little but watch their king fade. Death came on September 9, 1087, in a cold dawn that offered no mercy. William was 59, a titan brought low, not by an enemy's blade but by his own excesses. In his final hours, he dictated a will, a document as divisive as his life. To his eldest son, Robert, he left Normandy, but the English crown went to his younger son, William Rufus. It was a decision that would spark decades of strife, but William had no time to reconsider. As his breath faltered, his court dissolved into chaos. Nobles and servants, sensing the end, fled with whatever they could carry: gold, weapons, linens, leaving the king's body half naked on the floor of a medical facility in Rouen. This was no barbarian chieftain, no forgotten pauper, but the conqueror himself, abandoned in death as swiftly as he had once abandoned mercy. One man, a knight named Herluin, stepped into the void. Moved by duty or pity, he took it upon himself to prepare the king's body for burial. But time was not kind to William's corpse. Embalming, rudimentary at best, was delayed too long. The body, already decomposing, began to bloat as bacteria in the gut multiplied, filling the abdominal cavity with gas. Herluin, undeterred, arranged for the corpse to be transported 70 miles to Caen, where William had wished to be buried in the church he had founded, St. Etienne. The journey was slow, much of it by boat, down the Seine, the body jostling in the heat of early September. Each day, the gases built, the tissues softened, and the once mighty king became a grotesque parody of himself. When the cortege finally reached Caen, the city was in disarray. A fire had broken out, forcing mourners to abandon the funeral preparations to fight the flames. The delay stretched on, and William's body, wrapped in funeral sheets, continued its grim transformation. Then came another interruption, one almost farcical in its audacity. A man stepped forward, claiming the land on which the church stood was his, stolen by William years before. The funeral halted, turning into a legal dispute as the crowd, including William's son Henry, debated the claim. The man was eventually compensated, but the delay had pushed the body beyond its limits. By the time the mourners gathered again, William's corpse was a ticking bomb, swollen to monstrous proportions, its skin taut with the pressure of decay. The priests and gravediggers faced an impossible task. The stone sarcophagus, carved to fit a king, was too small for the bloated remains. They pushed, they prodded, they forced the body downward, desperate to complete the rite. And then, with a sound that must have echoed like a thunderclap, the corpse burst. The swollen bowels ruptured, spewing putrid matter across the tomb and onto the horrified onlookers. The stench was unbearable, a rancid assault that drove mourners to gag, to flee, to collapse in shock. Incense and prayers could not mask the horror. The funeral, meant to honor a conqueror, became a grotesque spectacle, a final humiliation for a man who had lived by the sword and died by his own excesses. In that moment, as the rancid air choked the mourners, and the priests scrambled to restore some semblance of dignity, the scene in St. Etienne's church became more than a funeral gone wrong. It was a mirror held up to William's life, a brutal reflection of a man whose conquests had always come at a cost, sometimes to others, sometimes to himself. The crowd, coughing and retching, could not unsee what had happened. The king who had stormed battlefields, who had built an empire across two nations, was now reduced to this, a broken vessel, his legacy tainted by the very body that had carried him to glory. But let's linger here, in the chaos of that moment, and ask ourselves, what does it mean when even death refuses to grant a king his dignity? What truths lie beneath the spectacle of a corpse that could not be contained? The priests, their faces pale, pressed on, they shoved the remains into the sarcophagus, sealing it with stone in haste, as if to bury not just the body but the memory of what had transpired. The mourners who remained, those who could stomach the stench, muttered prayers, their voices trembling. Yet the act felt hollow, a ritual stripped of reverence. William's funeral was meant to be a testament to his power, a final assertion of his place in history. Instead, it became a story whispered in taverns and chronicled by monks, a cautionary tale about hubris, mortality, and the fragility of even the mightiest men. But to understand why this moment resonated so deeply, why it shocked and horrified those who witnessed it, we need to peel back the layers of William's life and the world he shaped. A world where power was absolute, yet never secure. William's reign was a paradox. He was a man who built cathedrals and commissioned the Doomsday Book, a monumental survey of England's wealth that still stands as a marvel of medieval administration. Yet he was also the man who razed villages and left skeletons to bleach in the sun. His supporters called him a unifier, a king who brought order to fractious lands. His enemies, and there were many, saw a tyrant, a foreign usurper who crushed Anglo-Saxon freedoms under his Norman boot. The truth, as always, resists simplicity. William was neither hero nor monster, but a man shaped by the brutal necessities of his time. To rule in the 11th century was to live with a sword in one hand and a prayer in the other. knowing that neither could fully protect you. Consider the England he conquered. It was a land of deep divisions, where Anglo-Saxon earls, Danish settlers, and Norman mercenaries jostled for power. The old kings had struggled to hold it together, and Harold Godwinson's brief reign was proof of how fragile that unity was. William's invasion in 1066 didn't just topple a king, it rewrote the social order. He replaced Anglo-Saxon nobles with Norman lords, redistributed land to his loyalists, and built castles to enforce his will. These stone fortresses, places like the Tower of London, were not just defenses but symbols, looming reminders of who held the reins. To the English, they were scars on the landscape, proof of their subjugation. To William, they were the scaffolding of his empire. But empires are heavy, and William bore their weight in ways that went beyond politics. His body, the one that would betray him so spectacularly in death, was a battleground long before that fateful day in Caen. The chroniclers don't dwell on it, but we can piece together the toll his lifestyle took. He ate like a king, venison, swan, fruits preserved in honey, but also like a man who never knew when scarcity might return. His childhood, marked by betrayal and hunger, left a mark. The feasts of his later years were not just indulgence, but defiance, a refusal to be the boy who once hid from assassins. Yet the body keeps its own ledger. The rich foods, the endless campaigns, the stress of ruling to restless realms, it all accumulated, layer by layer, until William was no longer the lithe warrior of Hastings but a man whose weight strained his horses and mocked his armor. His injury, in 1087, that catastrophic moment in Rouen, was the culmination of those years. The sources are murky. Some say the saddle's pommel pierced his gut, others that his organs simply gave out under the strain. What's clear is that the wound was not a clean one. Internal injuries, especially to the intestines, were a death sentence in an age before antibiotics or surgical precision. Bacteria would have spread, turning his abdomen into a cesspool of infection. The bloating that followed, the grotesque swelling that led to the funeral's horror, was no supernatural curse but a grimly natural process. As the body shut down, gut microbes continued their work, producing gases that had nowhere to go. The heat of September, the delays in Caen, the jostling journey, all conspired to turn William's corpse into a ticking bomb. And yet, there's something almost poetic in the way his death unfolded. William spent his life forcing the world to bend to his will, lands, people, even history itself. But in death, he could not command his own flesh. The explosion of his corpse was not just a physical event but a metaphor, a reminder that no amount of power can defy the laws of nature. The mourners in St. Etienne's church, gagging on the stench, were confronted with the truth their king had spent his life ignoring. Mortality spares no one, not even a conqueror. Can you imagine their thoughts as they fled the church? Did they see it as divine judgment, a final reckoning for the blood on William's hands? Or was it simply horror, the kind that lingers in nightmares long after the day is done? Let's not rush past the human cost of that moment though. The priests, the gravediggers, the mourners, they were not just witnesses but victims of a sort, forced to endure a trauma that no ritual could erase. And what of Heroin, the knight who had carried William's body to Caen? We know so little about him, yet his act of loyalty stands out in a story filled with betrayal. Did he stay for the funeral, choking back bile as the corpse burst? Did he wonder why he had bothered, when even the king's own sons seemed more concerned with their inheritance than their father's dignity? William's sons, Robert, William Rufus, and Henry, were not even present when the body was abandoned. In Rouen their absence speaks volumes. Power, it seems, breeds not devotion but division, even within a family. The aftermath of the funeral was as messy as the event itself. William's sons plunged into conflict, each vying for a piece of their father's empire. Normandy and England, briefly united, began to fracture. The chroniclers, writing years later, struggled to make sense of William's legacy. Some praised his strength, his vision, his ability to forge order from chaos. Others could not forgive the bloodshed, the famines, the lives ground to dust under his ambition. The Doomsday Book, completed in 1086, offers a snapshot of his England, a land meticulously catalogued, its wealth counted down to the last pig and plow. But it also reveals a nation subdued, its people taxed and tethered to new masters. William's conquest was a triumph, but it was built on bones. As we stand in the shadow of that church in Caen, the stench of history still lingering, what do we take from this? William's life was a testament to the human capacity for creation and destruction, for greatness and cruelty. His death, so undignified, so shocking, forces us to confront the limits of that power. He was a man who reshaped the world, yet could not escape the frailties of his own body. His funeral, meant to enshrine his legacy, instead exposed the raw, unvarnished truth of mortality. And perhaps that's the lesson here, not just for kings, but for all of us. What do we build, and at what cost? What do we leave behind when the pomp and glory fade? The stone sarcophagus in St. Etienne still stands, a silent witness to that day in 1087. It holds what remains of William, though the centuries have not been kind. His bones were scattered during later wars, his tomb desecrated, until only a single thigh bone remained. Even in death, he could not rest. But the story of his exploding corpse endures, not as a footnote but as a warning. It reminds us that power, no matter how absolute, is fleeting. It tells us that the body, no matter how mighty, will betray us all. And it asks us, with a whisper that echoes across 1,000 years, what will your legacy be, when the stone is sealed and the mourners turn away?